Hello. Ever wondered what truly defines a master of melee combat in Rangers of Shadow Deep? Today we'll unravel the secrets behind the hand-to-hand encounters that could change the course of your game. In this comprehensive step-by-step guide to melee combat, we'll explore the foundational rules and intricate strategies that govern every hand-to-hand encounter. Every single detail, from understanding how to initiate combat to determining the winner and calculating damage. We'll also delve into the impact of weapons, traits, spells, heroic abilities, magic items, and consumables on your game, drawing from both the Standard Edition and a Gathering of Heroes rulebooks. So, if that sounds intriguing, let's begin. Alright, before we dive into the mechanics, let's take a moment to explain how this tutorial is structured. Combat in Rangers of Shadow Deep is a process made up of several phases, each influenced by a variety of details. At each step, starting with the combat initiation and ending with the post-combat actions, we'll first outline the framework to provide a general understanding, and then focus on the nuanced aspects that shape each game mechanic. To make this information-rich tutorial more engaging and easy to follow, we'll be joined today by Gwendolyn, a warrior clad in heavy armor and wielding a two-handed sword. Alongside her is Fergus, a skilled tracker equipped with the bow and specialized in traps and tracking. And of course, we have their adversaries: Skeleton, Ghoul, Spectre, and a good Gnoll Shaman. With the help of this team of performers, we are all set to jump into the action. Combat initiation. First, every melee encounter starts with the movement maneuvers. Typically, to initiate combat, whether it's by a single unit or as a part of a group, you should position your miniatures so that they are within 1 inch of the enemy. Simply being that close doesn't automatically trigger combat. To actually perform a melee attack, you need to spend an additional action point. Although that's usually the only action you can take in this situation, it's important to note that you are not forced to engage. If you decide not to attack, your figure typically won't take any further actions during its activation. There is another rule to keep in mind: forcing combat. If you or any other figure is within 1 inch of the enemy figure, there is an option to force them into combat. This is a useful way to stop enemy figures from moving freely past the figures. It might not come up often in solo campaigns, since monsters generally out-engage the nearest player figure and won't usually try to slip by narrow passages, but still, there may be rare exceptions where this rule proves being handy. Determining a combat score. When an attack action is taken, the player or players roll a d20 for each of the fighting sides. At this stage, it doesn't matter how many figures are involved overall, the fight itself is resolved between 2 figures per action spent. After rolling, each side adds their fight stat and any applicable bonuses to determine their combat score. These scores are then compared, and the side with the higher total wins the fight. It's worth noting that a natural roll of 20 during this stage is considered a critical hit. The figure that rolls it automatically wins the fight regardless of the opponent's combat score. Monsters, however, cannot score critical hits. For them, a natural 20 is simply treated as the high roll. Critical hits also deal additional damage, but we'll cover that in more detail when we discuss damage mechanics. This mechanic of a fight is designed to replicate the feel of a duel between 2 opposing sides. Importantly, no matter who initiates the fight, there is a risk of being hit by the defending party. It's also important to note that the positioning of the figures, whether flanked or backstabbed, doesn't come into play here. The fight assumes that both figures are facing each other during the engagement. Now, let's delve into the nuances. Beyond the random die roll, here is a detailed list of all the factors that can influence the combat score. Let's start with the heroic abilities and spells. If you want your ranger to perform better in combat, you're more likely willing to include the ones in this list. While most abilities in the Standard Edition rulebook are pretty straightforward, I'd like to explain the sneak attack unique heroic ability in more detail. To unlock that, your ranger needs its prerequisite trait, disguised as the enemy, which is only available if you choose Survivor of Shadow Deep archetype for your ranger. While you can spend points on the rare heroic ability trait to unlock unique heroic abilities, there is no clear rule that lets you gain the disguised as the enemy trait any other way. You could potentially adjust the story or create a scenario to justify your ranger acquiring it, something Joseph McCullough encourages by the way, but by default, this ability seems tied to the Survivor of Shadow Deep archetype only. New features like traits and limitations introduced in the Gathering of Heroes can also impact the final combat score. As mentioned earlier, some traits and limitations are specific to certain archetypes. For example, both Plant Warden and Weapon and Armor limitations are exclusive to the Chthonian Mage archetype. Interestingly, some Weapon and Armor limitations apply to other archetypes as well. However, only Chthonian mages are allowed to use certain weapons they aren't trained with, even though doing so incurs a penalty to their combat score. For other archetypes, certain equipment types are completely prohibited. When discussing combat, it's natural to address weapons at some point. In the world of Rangers of Shadow Deep, melee weapons are divided into two categories: basic weapons, which are freely available from the King's Armory, and advanced weapons, which you can find as a loot during your adventures. While all weapons have a damage parameter, not all contribute to the combat score needed to determine the winner of a fight. Among the basic weapons, none provide a bonus to the combat score. Additionally, fighting unarmed carries a penalty of -2 to your fight stat, making it a significant disadvantage in combat. Advanced weapons, on the other hand, are typically found as a loot in treasure caches during your adventures. According to the Standard Edition rulebook, these weapons often include a range of special attributes you can see on your screen. The topic of weapons is quite extensive, so for this tutorial we'll focus on a few key attributes: blocking, elemental strike, and magic. We'll set aside blocking and elemental strike for now, as they are more relevant when discussing the damage dealing process, and prioritize magic, as it's the only property that directly affects the combat score. Here is a comprehensive list of weapons that can influence the combat score. It's a bit detailed, so feel free to pause the video to review it closely. You'll notice that most weapons are described in generalized terms, and to make navigation easier, I've added identifiers. For items from the Standard Edition treasure list, you'll see a die roll number, while items from the Gathering of Heroes list are marked with the card references like QD for Queen of Diamonds and 7H for 7 of Hearts. Hopefully, those notations feel familiar. While you review the list, let me explain how the magic property works. Weapons with this attribute usually have a specific number of charges listed in the parentheses. This indicates how many times the magic can be activated before the weapon loses its powers and becomes an ordinary weapon. Unlike blocking or elemental strike, which are activated for individual fights, the magic property can be used throughout the entire scenario. Weapons with the magic property provide two benefits. They add +1 to your combat score, and they can deal full damage to monsters that fully or partially resistant to non-magical attacks. Typically, the charges for magical weapons cannot be replenished. However, in the Gathering of Heroes list, there are rare exceptions where certain weapons can regain their charges. Each weapon has unique conditions for recharging, so I haven't included full details in the list. To help you spot them, I've marked these weapons as rechargeable. Additionally, weapons from Gathering of Heroes list often require a read runes or armory skill check to unlock certain traits. After a mission or a scenario, when you are reorganizing your party, any figure that participated can roll a skill check to determine if the weapon's special attributes can be activated. If the check succeeds, the attributes are unlocked. If not, they remain undiscovered. We've spent a bit more time on weapons because it's such a broad and important topic. If you think it deserves a dedicated video, let me know by pressing the like button, and I'll consider creating one focused entirely on that. Now, let's move on to the other types of equipment and consumables. Occasionally, as a ranger, you'll come across magical items or alchemical consumables in treasure caches. Most magical items have a limited number of uses, which is usually noted in the brackets, and they can be activated as a free action. In contrast, herbs and potions require an action point to use them, but remain effective for an entire scenario. Here is a list of items that specifically impact the combat score. Lastly, let's talk about another key factor in determining the combat score: friendly support. While fights are resolved between two figures at a time, there are situations where multiple figures are clustered together, each within the combat reach of another. In these cases, figures not directly involved in the fight can provide support. The Standard Edition rulebook outlines several examples of clustered combat scenarios, but they can all be simplified into one rule of thumb. Support bonuses are only granted when friendly figures outnumber the opposing figures within the combat reach. Each supporting figure adds +2 to the supported figure's combat score. Here is a simple example. In a 2v1 situation, where both friendly figures are within the combat reach, the outnumbering figure gains a +2 bonus per its supporting figure to its combat score during the duel. In contrast, considering a 2v2 situation, since both sides have an equal number of figures within combat reach, no support bonus is applied. This is crucial. Even though applying bonuses in even fight would cancel each other anyway at the combat score level, but that will however affect the damage calculation further down the line, so make sure you don't account for support bonuses in these cases. A tiny detail for those eager to have animal companions. Have a closer look at animal attributes such as can be carried and reuse support. When having an animal companion in the fight, these two features make the difference. The former one requires the animal to be deployed on the ground to be able to lend a support. The later one gives you a +1 per companion instead of +2. Just a tiny note to be aware of. I know, there is a lot to take in, but if you made it this far, you are truly persistent. If you are still enjoying the content, please consider subscribing. It really helps. Thank you. Let's keep going. Dealing damage. So, once the combat is calculated, it's time to compare the results. The side with the highest score wins the fight and can deal damage. However, if the scores are equal, both parties are allowed to deal damage to each other. If you lose the fight, there is still a chance to block the incoming damage, provided you have one of the following items. Keep in mind, you still lose the fight, but you won't suffer damage. In most cases, determining the amount of damage dealt follows a straightforward process. First, take the winner's combat score and add any additional damage modifiers. Then, subtract the opponent's armor value and any applicable armor modifiers. The result is your net damage. If its value is larger than 0, the damage is considered being dealt. Any above 0 value should be subtracted from the loser's health to determine their current state. If a monster's health is reduced to 0, it's considered slain. For a ranger, or their companions, the figure is considered knocked out, and its fate will be decided after the scenario. Sometimes, net damage is adjusted by damage multiplier. These multipliers, as described in the rulebooks, typically come from powerful creatures or weapons. The most common example is resistance to non-magical weapons, which halves the physical net damage dealt to the opponent. There may be more specific examples within the individual scenario, but as of now, I have not seen any. If you have encountered such situations, feel free to share your experience. I'd love to hear about that actually. What influences damage? The list is actually quite short and straightforward, so we won't dive too deep here. A handful of heroic abilities, spells, traits and some consumables can all play a role in modifying damage. Weaponry deserves some special attention and explanation when it comes to damage. In addition to what we covered in the combat score section, the weapon types also plays the key role in determining damage. Each type comes with its own modifiers. For instance, daggers, throwing knives, and unarmed attacks reduce the final damage output. Hand weapons, typically one-handed, don't suffer any penalties. Two-handed weapons provide a damage bonus, and staffs are quite unique. They reduce damage dealt, but also reduce damage taken. These rules apply not only to the basic weapons, but also to treasure weapons found in the standard edition or a gathering of heroes. Treasure weapons often include additional effects due to being enchanted. For example, the first weapon in the Gathering of Heroes treasure list, an enchanted two-handed weapon, provides a +2 damage bonus, just like a basic two-handed weapon, and an additional +1 damage against spiders. Additionally, weapons with elemental strike attributes add more to damage dealing. If the wielder wins the fight and deals at least 1 damage, they can choose to deal an extra +5 elemental magic damage. However, this is limited by the number of uses indicated in parentheses. Finally, the last damage modifier to consider is a critical hit. Rolling a natural 20 on a d20 grants an extra +5 damage to your attack. There is not much to say about armor, as it's a fairly straightforward aspect of the game mechanics. Armor is entirely gear dependent and quite limited in variety. Heroes typically wear either heavy armor, light armor, or no armor at all, sometimes paired with the shield actually. This attribute is primarily determined by the equipment chosen, and only a small number of items can influence it. So, if you are trying to build a tank ranger, that's pretty much a complete list of aspects that affect armor parameter. After combat, once the damage is calculated and subtracted from the loser's health points, there are a few steps to follow. First, check whether the remaining health points of the target or your own figure are above 0. If there are still health points left, you also need to determine if the attack caused any side effects like poison or disease. If the health is reduced to 0 or lower, the outcome is straightforward. Monsters are considered slain, while rangers and their companions are removed from the play until the end of scenario. After that, the winner of the fight gets to decide what happens next. Whether or not damage was dealt, the winner can choose to stay in combat, step back 1 inch to disengage, push the loser 1 inch in any direction. This push can sometimes create a tactical advantage, like knocking an enemy off the ledge to cause extra falling damage. These movements aren't affected by rough terrain, but they should follow common sense. Figures can be pushed into or step into large terrain features, for example. There are also some gray areas when it comes to certain types of creatures. The rulebooks don't specify whether large creatures or non-physical beings like specters can be pushed. If it feels right for your scenario, go ahead and allow it. But if you prefer to stick to a more realistic approach, you can restrict it. Finally, if you decide not to remain in combat, neither figure can force combat again as a result of that disengagement. Keep in mind though, that evil creatures will almost always stay in combat if they win the fight, unless the scenario states otherwise. Let's talk about poison and disease. These effects typically come from monsters with specific traits and only apply if you take at least 1 point of damage during a lost combat action. Starting with poison. If you are hit by a monster with the poison attribute, you are poisoned immediately. This reduces your available action points by 1. Most of the time, this leaves you with just 1 action point, which you can use for any action. Unlike the usual 2 action points, there is no requirement to spend it on a mandatory move action. Poison can be cured if you regain the full health during the same scenario, but if not, it automatically clears at the end of the game. Poison doesn't stack, so once you are poisoned, you won't take additional penalties for being poisoned again. Disease, on the other hand, is a bit more complex. When you take damage from a monster with the disease attribute, the affected ranger or companion must make a health check. The target number for this check is listed in the bestiary. To perform the check, you roll a die, add your current health points and see if the total meets or exceeds the target number. If the check fails, the figure is considered diseased. While disease doesn't have an immediate effect, its impact begins at the start of the next scenario. A diseased figure starts with -3 health points and suffer a -1 penalty to all rolls during that game. If the figure's health is reduced to 0 or below because of this, they must skip the next scenario entirely. However, in all cases, the disease is automatically cured after one game. There are 2 consumables that can remove the effect of disease: Night Knock and Potion of Restoration. Using those between scenarios prevents the negative effects of disease from taking place. Alright, that's been a lot to cover. Let's simplify everything into a clear step-by-step process and highlight the top 3 key factors to focus on when creating a melee-focused ranger. First, combat begins when your figures are positioned within 1 inch of the enemy and you spend an action to perform an attack. Keep in mind, you can also force combat on any figure within 1 inch range. Next, both sides roll the dice and add their fight stat along with the applicable modifiers. These can come from heroic abilities, spells, traits, limitations, treasure weapons, magic items, consumables, or friendly support within the combat reach. The higher score wins the fight, but if the scores are tight, both parties deal damage. And remember, a natural roll of 20 is considered a critical hit and is always a win. Then, the winner's combat score serves as the starting point for calculating net damage. You'll add any damage modifiers, typically from weapons, including their base damage and any elemental or enchanted effects. Modifiers also come from a few specific heroic abilities, spells, traits, or consumables. If you scored a critical hit, include that bonus as well. Next, subtract the opponent's armor stat and any modifiers which can come from certain spells, limitations, weapons, magic items, or consumables. In rare cases, net damage may be affected by a damage multiplier. For example, some monsters only take half damage from non-magical weapons. You can avoid taking damage after losing a combat by blocking the blow, but only if you have a treasure weapon with the blocking attribute equipped and used during the combat. If damage is taken, start by subtracting the amount of net damage from your current health stat to determine your updated health. If a monster's health drops to 0, remove it from the table. If a ranger or companion's health reaches 0, place them down. They are out of action and their fate is decided at the end of the scenario. If health remains above 0, check whether a figure is affected by poison or disease. Finally, if you are a winner, decide whether to stay in combat, step back, or push your opponent back to gain a tactical advantage. Monsters usually remain in combat. As we have discussed, creating an effective duelist in the world of Rangers of Shadow Deep comes down to focusing on 3 key factors during character creation and throughout the game. First, fight stat. This is your primary attribute for melee combat. I recommend maxing it out at the start and prioritizing it during early leveling. A high fight stat will always give you a solid foundation for success in combat. Next, heroic abilities and traits. We've covered a list of these earlier, so feel free to rewind and note them down for reference. Investing in a couple of these early on will significantly enhance your ranger's combat potential. The last is weapons. Loot plays a major role in effective fighting, though it's often beyond our control. What you can control is your starting weaponry. A two-handed weapon is a great choice for dealing solid damage right away. For a more defensive approach, pairing a hand weapon with the shield works well. And if you acquire the 2-weapon fighter trait, dual wielding becomes an excellent option too. Yeah, that's it. And if you made it so far, you're truly tough. Have a cookie. I hope this guide has been helpful. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rules, but to keep things concise, I've left those out of this tutorial. Instead, I'll save them for the part 2, where we'll dive into the nuances and twists that shake up the standard combat process. If you don't want to miss it and enjoy the content, please consider subscribing to the channel. That's all for now. Take care.